Section 14 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 11, The War of Pavilla, 1515 to 1527, Part 2. The great French and Spanish War of 1521 was fierce and deadly beyond all precedent, aiming at nothing less than the complete dismemberment of France. When Henry took the Spanish side openly in the following June, Francis was called upon to surrender to the Emperor Burgundy, Champagne, Dauphiné, Languedoc, and Provence, and to Henry the Isle of France, Picardy, Normandy, and Guienne. And of the brutalities committed by both invaders of France we may judge by the letters of Lord Surrey to his master, in which he calmly announces that the Boulonnais is so burned and ravaged that the French have good reason to be angry. All the country, he continues, that we have passed through has been burned, and all the strong places thrown down. When we have burned Dourlon, Corbie, Ancre, Bray, and the neighbouring country, I do not see that we can do much more. The Emperor's council are willing that Hesdin should be burnt, which shall be done within 3 hours. In 1523 Surrey was superseded, and the army placed under the Duke of Suffolk. It approached within a few miles of Paris, but its sufferings from the severe winter were terrible, many soldiers being frozen to death, and others losing their fingers or toes. It was impossible to persevere under such difficulties, and for the second time in his reign an English army went home without orders, having thus added another to the random and ineffective military operations which mark the period. The war went on without us and produced many striking events, one of which was the capture of Francis I by the Emperor's generals at Pavilla. After relieving Marseille from its siege by the Imperialists in the autumn of 1524, Francis had resolved on crossing Mont Cenis and surprising Milan, which was defended by only 16,000 of Charles's troops. This he effected with signal success, the Spanish garrison retreating to the Adda. Instead of pursuing and finishing the war on the spot, the French king occupied himself for 3 whole months in besieging Pavilla on the Tesino, at the same time detaching 6,000 men to make a diversion on Naples, and thus leaving his army no more than equal to the enemy in numbers. In spite of this, he held himself bound in honour to persist in the siege, because he had declared that he would reduce the place or die in the attempt. He was therefore attacked in his position by Charles's generals from the outside, while Leyva, the governor of the city, made a desperate sally from within. The double shock threw the French army into complete disorder. First its Swiss mercenaries fled. Then a well-arranged attack broke its cavalry. Francis himself lost his horse and narrowly escaped being killed by some Spanish foot soldiers who did not recognize him. His ruin was complete, for 10,000 of his soldiers had fallen, and he himself had to bear a long and bitter captivity in Spain, from which he was only released upon intolerably hard conditions. Among those who fell at Pavilla was a leading member of the House of York, Richard de la Pole, the younger brother of the Lord Lincoln who fell at Stoke. Another consequence of the Pavilla War was our being engaged in a new struggle with Scotland, to which Francis had again dispatched the Duke of Albany in 1521, in order to keep up the French interest there. Even Margaret herself now took that side, because Henry had refused to sanction her divorce from Angus, whom she had begun to detest most heartily. So when the King of England demanded Albany's expulsion, he was on the contrary placed at the head of an army of 60,000 men with a strong artillery and sent to invade England. The old jealousy against his French companions, however, prevented anything important from being done. The Scots failed in the siege of Wark Castle and then retreated. This opened the way for a more conciliatory policy. Henry tried all means for gaining the affection of the young king his nephew, and even thought for a while of marrying him to his daughter Mary, so as to renew the scheme of uniting the kingdoms. But such a measure was too wise and wholesome for the times, and it was held to be enough for the present to raise up a party in Scotland which should declare James of full age and capable of governing. This plan succeeded, and in August 1524 James appeared before his nobles with sceptre and crown, and undertook to rule the country with the advice of his most beloved mother and the lords of the council. In the following November this step was sanctioned by an act of the Scottish Parliament, and the hopes of France in that country were for the present at an end. The wars of this time appear wanton and perverse in themselves, and much more so when we consider how impossible they made expeditions to which Europe was really bound by every tie of honour and interest. Henry VIII, like his father, was the official protector of the Knights of St. John, who had since 1310 constantly made their island of Rhodes the outwork of Christendom in the East. Yet in 1523 he, in common with the other great powers, allowed them to be besieged by the Sultan Soliman in person without raising a finger to help them. The events of the siege are admirably related by Nicholas Roberts, a member of the order. The Turks had 150,000 men at least, and the besieged not more than 6,000, so that rest was almost impossible. Even the Grand Master, the noble Lille Adam, slept as he best might upon the ground. Numbers of huge stone balls were fired into the city from the Turkish mortars, shattering as they fell with an effect like that of shells. Breaches were made over and over again, but as often repaired by the skill of the engineer Martinengo. After a while the Turks began a system of mines, yet even when whole bastions were blown into the air, the knights continued to repulse the storming parties. But at length the enemy drove horizontal galleries 150 paces within the walls, and a breach was made which 30 horsemen could enter abreast. Then, and not until then, the place surrendered and was treated not ungenerously by the conqueror. Transferred by Charles V in 1530 to the island of Malta, the order within 40 years recovered strength for the equally firm and more fortunate defence against their old enemies of the harbour and walls of Valletta, the capital of their new domain, which they continued to occupy till the island was taken by Napoleon in 1800. The French war, however useless and ineffective, had of course to be paid for by the people of England, and Wolsey made in 1523 the terrible demand of 26% on real and personal property, and of half a year's income from the clergy. It was estimated that this would produce about £800,000, but the unwillingness to submit to such taxation was extreme. Wolsey himself came to the House of Commons to argue the point, and Sir Thomas More, who was Speaker, recommended the House to receive him with all his pillar and pole-axe bearers. The Cardinal, he said, has been blaming us for not keeping our debates secret. We can turn the tables upon him if he brings his attendants into the House and runs the risk of their making known what passes in it. When the great minister had made his speech, there was a complete silence. On his asking More for a reply, he was told in the most respectful language that it was the manner of his Grace's faithful Commons to debate matters only among themselves, and that the Speaker, though trusted beyond his deserts by the House, could not venture to declare their views without an express commission from them. Except by this spirited declaration, More does not seem to have displeased the government by his conduct in the debate, and about half the sum demanded was voted by the House. An exception was given to the northern counties which had borne the burden of the Scottish war, and also to the district of Brighthelmstone in Sussex, doubtless because the place had been burned by the French in 1514. Even with these deductions, the pressure of the subsidy was simply ruinous. and when in 1525 Wolsey farther proposed to raise what he called an amicable loan, England was brought to the verge of a peasants' war like that which was horrifying Germany in the same year. The Kentish men complained to Warham that as the subsidy of 1523 was not yet fully paid, it was too bad to ask for more money already, and were not mollified by his reminder that His Majesty was born in Kent. They wept, pleaded poverty, and then began to speak cursedly. There would be no rest from payments as long as someone lived. Wolsey, it may be remarked, was already unpopular in that county for suppressing Tunbridge Priory and devoting its funds to his new college in Oxford. Strong remonstrances also came from other quarters. The Bishop of Ely wrote to say that there was no ready money in his diocese, and that to procure it people had to sell their cattle at half its value. In Norwich, folks tendered their spoons and salt cellars for want of cash, and there was every appearance that the cloth-makers would have to stop work and dismiss their hands. In an interview with Wolsey, the Lord Mayor of London reminded him of Richard III's statute against benevolences, and failed to see the force of his reply that he wondered his lordship should quote the law of a bad king who murdered his nephews, and who, being also an usurper, could not make laws binding a legitimate king. But the end was that the cardinal was struck with the arguments alleged, and himself persuaded Henry to allow people to give only what they chose. No one, of course, came forward, and the benevolence was heard of no more. Though Wolsey might have truly said that it had been no plan of his, yet his loyal silence left its unpopularity to weigh on him, and at the same time the king was not less angry that the scheme had failed than the people were that it had been attempted. After the Battle of Pavilla, the European war still went on in Italy. Hence arose in 1527 one of the most frightful catastrophes of the Middle Ages. For the Constable Bourbon, having deserted his country to take the command of a mixed force belonging to Charles, found himself unable to pay his troops, and was obliged to connive at all their excesses. At last they forced him to attack Rome, and after 2 repulses made their way into the Leonine city at the back of St. Peter's, as Bourbon himself was killed in the assault, perhaps by a shot from the celebrated sculptor Benvenuto Cellini. Even the slight control which he might have exercised was at an end. The Pope and cardinals just escaped into the castle of Sant'Angelo, and then had the gates closed against the crowd of distracted fugitives. For the 12 next days the city suffered the most indescribable horrors. Fanatical German Protestants, renegade Italians, and ruthless Spaniards vying with one another in the crimes which they committed, and the unhappy people being tortured by those of each nation in turn to make them produce the valuables of which they had already been robbed by the others. Clement VII, who had been elected Pope in 1523, remained the Emperor's prisoner in Rome till December, when he escaped in disguise to Orvieto. Even there he was far from free or safe, and the next chapters will show the important consequences to England of his quasi-captivity. End of section 14.